I never thought that a piece of paper signed by an instructor could be both the fulfillment of a dream and a death sentence at the same time. But that's exactly what happened on that October 15th, 1998, when I received my authorization for my first solo flight. My name is Jake, and at 17 years old I was just another kid obsessed with airplanes. Since I was 5, when my dad took me to watch planes take off at our local regional airport, I knew I wanted to fly. Not as a passenger, but as a pilot. I wanted to feel the controls in my hands, understand every sound the engine made, every vibration of the fuselage. I had spent the last 8 months saving every penny from my part-time job at the local grocery store to pay for flight lessons. My mum thought it was crazy. Planes crash, Jake, she always said. My dad, on the other hand, understood the passion. He himself had dreamed of flying when he was young, but life had taken him down other paths. The flight school where I trained was located about 25 miles from town, at a small grass strip that looked more like an elongated soccer field. Cedar Valley flight training had only 3 aircraft, 2 Cessna 152s and an older Piper Cherokee that was older than my parents. My instructor, Captain Mike Rodriguez, everyone called him Captain, even though he was civilian, was a former Air Force pilot with over 30 years of experience and the patience of a saint when dealing with teenage aspiring pilots. During those 8 months, we flew together 47 times. I knew every detail of that Cessna 152 with tail number November 748. Charlie Delta by heart. The specific sound the Lycoming O235 engine made during takeoff, how the yoke vibrated during final approach, even where that small scratch on the panel was that always helped me focus during emergency procedures. Captain Rodriguez was meticulous. He made me practice landings and takeoffs until I could make a perfect approach, even with crosswinds. He taught me to read the sky like an open book, how to identify cumulus, cirrus, nimbostratus, and especially how to recognize signs of unstable weather. He made me memorize all emergency procedures: engine failure, electrical failure, fire on board, forced approach. Jake, he would say with his deep, measured voice, a pilot isn't someone who knows how to fly when everything's going well. A pilot is someone who knows what to do when everything goes wrong. In the last week before my solo flight, he had started becoming quieter during flights. Sometimes I'd look to the side and see he was just observing, with his hands crossed in his lap, letting me make all the decisions. It was a good sign. It meant he was trusting me. On October 14th, after a training flight where I practiced emergencies for 2 hours, he finally said the words I'd been waiting to hear for months: "I think you're ready, kid." That night, I could barely sleep. I kept imagining what it would be like to be alone in that cockpit, hearing only the sound of the engine and the wind, without Captain Rodriguez's reassuring presence beside me. Would it be total freedom or absolute terror? Probably a bit of both. On the morning of the 15th, I arrived at Cedar Valley at 7:30 a.m., an hour before the scheduled time. I wanted to personally check every detail of the aircraft, do an even more careful pre-flight inspection than normal. November 748. Charlie Delta was parked in the ramp area, gleaming with morning dew, still wet on the wings. I started the inspection at the propeller, checking for damage or cracks in the blades. I ran my hands along the leading edges of the wings, looking for any irregularities. I checked the ailerons, flaps, rudder, elevator. All flight controls moved smoothly. I opened the engine cowling and visually inspected hoses, cables, oil level. Everything perfect. When Captain Rodriguez arrived at 8:20 a.m., he found me sitting in the cockpit, mentally reviewing all procedures. "Nervous?" he asked, putting his hand on my shoulder. "A little," I admitted, "but more anxious than nervous." "That's good. A little adrenaline keeps you alert. But remember, you've done this dozens of times. The only difference is that today I won't be here beside you." He handed me a sheet of paper, my solo flight authorization signed and stamped. It was a simple document, but to me it was worth more than any diploma. "The plan is simple," he said, opening the sectional chart and pointing to our position. "You're going to take off on runway 09er, climb to 3,000 feet, make a standard traffic pattern keeping the runway always in sight, and land. 30 minutes maximum. No adventures, no aerobatics. Straight and level flight, clean pattern, smooth landing." "Understood." "Understood, Captain." "And Jake? If anything at all seems strange or different, You come back immediately for landing. There's no shame in aborting a flight if conditions aren't ideal. At 8:45 a.m. I started the engine. The Lycoming came to life with that familiar roar. RPM stabilized at 1,000, all instruments indicating normal parameters. I did the engine checks, tested flight controls, checked the radios, everything working perfectly. I called ground control for taxi clearance. Actually, it was just Bob, the airport operator, who stayed in a small room overlooking the runway and communicated by radio with pilots. It wasn't an official control tower, but it served the function. November 748. Charlie Delta taxi approved to runway 09er. Winds calm, altimeter 2992, time 1545 Zulu, came Bob's voice over the radio. I taxied slowly to the runway threshold, my heart beating faster with each meter. At the hold short line, I did the final check before takeoff. Mixture rich, prop in low pitch, flaps set for takeoff, controls free and correct, instruments in the green. November 748. Charlie Delta, cleared for takeoff runway 09er. Cleared for takeoff runway 09er, November 748, Charlie Delta. Align with the runway center line, advance power progressively, RPM climbing 2100, 2200, 2300. Speed increasing, 40 knots, 50 knots. At 55 knots, I gently pulled back on the yoke. The wheels left the ground. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I was flying alone. The sensation was indescribable. During the first 5 minutes, I felt simultaneously free as a bird and terrified as a lost child. Without Captain Rodriguez's weight in the right seat, the aircraft felt lighter, more responsive to my commands. Every movement of the yoke translated into more immediate changes in the aircraft's attitude. I climbed to 3,000 feet, maintaining a 500 feet per minute rate of climb, exactly as I had trained. The altimeter rotated slowly, 1,500 feet, 2,000 feet, 2,500 feet. The landscape below became smaller. Houses looked like dollhouses. Roads turned into lines on a map. At 3,000 feet, I leveled the aircraft and reduced power to 2,200 RPM cruise configuration. I flew straight for a few minutes, savoring the experience. The sky was clear, with just a few cumulus clouds scattered much higher, around 6,000 feet. Unlimited visibility, perfect conditions for a first solo flight. After about 10 minutes of flight, I started a gentle left turn to return to the airport. That's when I should have made the traffic pattern and landed. Simple, straightforward, no complications. But that's when I noticed something strange. Looking west, in the direction I had come from, I noticed a dark line on the horizon. These weren't the friendly cumulus clouds I had seen before. It was something denser, more threatening. It looked like a grey-black wall approaching. I immediately remembered the meteorology lessons. Cumulonimbus clouds are dangerous for small aircraft. Captain Rodriguez's voice echoed in my mind. Severe turbulence, downdrafts, hail, lightning. When you see a wall of dark clouds approaching, you better already be on the ground. But I was only 15 minutes from the airport. Those clouds still seemed distant. I thought I could make the pattern and land safely before they arrived. I continued flying toward the airport, but kept my eyes on the cloud formation approaching. Within minutes, I realized they were moving much faster than I had calculated, and they were growing. What before seemed like a dark line on the horizon now occupied a good part of the western sky. When I was about 8 nautical miles from the airport, I tried to contact Bob. Cedar Valley traffic, November 748, Charlie Delta on position. Silence. Cedar Valley traffic, November 748, Charlie Delta requesting weather information. Silence again. Strange. The radio had been working perfectly just minutes ago. I checked the volume, frequency, tried again. Nothing. The radio had failed completely. That's when I looked west again and felt a chill in my stomach. The wall of clouds now occupied half the sky and was moving in my direction at a frightening speed. These weren't just clouds. It was a complete storm front, with visible lightning flashing inside the grey-black mass. I increased power to 2,400 RPM and pushed the nose down, trying to gain speed. I needed to reach the airport before the storm. But when I looked toward where the airport should be, I felt my stomach tighten. I couldn't see the airport anymore. Not that it was too far away, I simply couldn't identify it. The landscape below had changed. Flying alone, focused on the threatening cloud formation, I had completely lost my visual references. I didn't recognize any landmarks on the ground. No familiar roads, no lakes or mountains that would help me orient myself. I was completely lost. I tried to stay calm and resort to what Captain Rodriguez had taught me. If you get lost, don't panic. First thing, keep the aircraft controlled. Second thing, try to identify where you are using the sectional chart. Third thing, if you can't orient yourself, look for an alternate airport or a suitable area for forced landing. I grabbed the sectional chart that was folded in the side pocket. Flying with one hand on the yoke and trying to examine the map with the other, I looked for any reference that would help me identify my position. Rivers, roads, cities, anything. But the storm was approaching faster than I could process the information. The first wind gusts started to shake the aircraft. What before was smooth flight now became a constant struggle to maintain control. Suddenly, I felt the aircraft give a violent jolt upward, then another downward. Turbulence. I gripped the yoke tightly, trying to keep the wings level. The airspeed indicator oscillated between 70 and 90 knots. The irregular air currents were completely affecting the aircraft's performance. That's when I saw the first raindrops hitting the windshield. Within seconds, visibility began to decrease dramatically. What before was a clear view of the terrain below now became a grey and diffuse mass. I looked at the fuel gauge and felt another knot in my stomach. The needle showed a quarter tank. With this turbulence and having to maintain higher RPM to fight the winds, I was consuming fuel much faster than normal. Rain was now falling torrentially. The noise in the cockpit had changed completely. Besides the engine roar, I now heard the constant drumming of water on the fuselage metal. Visibility had reduced to less than a mile. I couldn't see anything but grey curtains of water. I tried descending to find better conditions below the clouds, but at 2,000 feet, the situation was even worse. I climbed again to 2,500 feet, then to 3,000. The turbulence was intense at any altitude. That's when I looked at the instrument panel and felt terror take hold of me. The attitude indicator was showing a 30-degree bank to the right, but my body felt like I was flying straight and level. Spatial disorientation. Captain Rodriguez had warned me about this. When you can't see the natural horizon, you have to trust the instruments, not your sensations. I forced myself to look only at the instruments. Attitude indicator showing right bank, corrected with left aileron. Altimeter showing descent, gently pulled back on the yoke. Airspeed indicator showing speed loss, increased power slightly. But flying purely on instruments was something I had practiced very little. Captain Rodriguez always said this would be taught later, during instrument rating training. A visual flight pilot like me should avoid flying in low visibility conditions, and there I was. With only 40 hours of flight time, trying to keep an aircraft controlled in the middle of a storm, lost, with fuel decreasing, flying purely on instruments. The turbulence was getting worse every minute. The aircraft was shaking violently, climbing and descending like an uncontrolled roller coaster. My stomach was churning, and I was starting to feel nauseous. My hands were sweating so much I could barely hold the yoke properly. I tried again to contact someone on the radio, trying any frequency that might help me. Emergency frequency 121.5, frequencies of regional airports I knew, even the approach control frequency from the state capital, which was more than 60 miles away. Nothing. Absolute silence. The radio was completely dead. That's when I realized other instruments were also starting to fail. The fuel gauge now oscillated between empty and 1/8, as if it had some electrical problem. The airspeed indicator sometimes froze for a few seconds, then returned to working. The compass rotated slowly, without pointing to a fixed direction. Electrical failure. The intense rain had probably caused some short circuit in the aircraft's electrical system. Without electricity, I would gradually lose all instruments except those purely mechanical like the altimeter and some engine instruments. I looked again at the fuel gauge. Even considering it might be malfunctioning, it was evident I didn't have fuel for much longer, maybe 20 or 30 minutes at best. I needed to find a place to land immediately. I descended to 1,500 feet, trying to fly below the cloud base to improve visibility. The turbulence at this altitude was even more violent, but at least I could see some stretches of ground between the rain curtains. I desperately searched for any sign of a runway. An airport, a straight and wide road, a large and level field, anything that could serve for an emergency landing. The landscape below was mountainous and covered with dense forest. Occasionally I saw some small clearings, but nothing that seemed adequate for landing an aircraft. There were few roads, and those I could see were narrow and winding, completely inadequate. The clock on the panel showed 10:30 a.m. I had taken off at 8:45 a.m. 1 hour and 45 minutes in the air, much longer than the 30-minute flight I had planned, and I still had no idea where I was. Anguish began to give way to desperation. I was lost, with fuel running out, instruments failing, in the middle of a storm, flying over hostile terrain without communication with anyone. All the conditions a pilot never wants to face, and especially not on their first solo flight. That's when I remembered something Captain Rodriguez had said during one of our theoretical classes. Jake, if you ever find yourself in an impossible situation, remember, focus on what you can control, not what's out of your control. You can control the aircraft's attitude, you can control speed, you can make decisions about where to fly. You can't control the weather, can't make fuel appear out of nowhere, can't make the radio work by magic. Focus on what's within your reach. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down. I was alive. The aircraft was still flying, the engine was still running. I had enough fuel for at least a few more minutes. I could see the ground even if visibility was limited. I continued flying straight, maintaining 1,500 feet, systematically searching for any landing option. 5 minutes later, through an opening in the rain curtains, I saw something that made my heart race. A road. It wasn't a highway, but it was straight, relatively wide, and seemed to have at least 1.5 miles of extension, without sharp curves or obvious obstacles. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option I had seen so far. I circled over the road, trying to assess its conditions. It appeared to be asphalt. There were no visible cars, and although there were trees on both sides, there was enough space for an approach. The trees weren't very tall, maybe 30 or 50 feet. The biggest problem was the wind. The storm brought strong and irregular gusts that would make an approach extremely difficult. But I had no choice. The fuel was almost gone. I positioned myself for a final approach. I configured flaps for landing, reduced power, maintained 70 knots of speed. The aircraft was shaking violently due to wind gusts, and I was constantly fighting to maintain alignment with the road. At 500 feet height, a lateral wind gust pushed the aircraft to the right. I corrected quickly, but lost alignment. I aborted the approach, applied full power and climbed again. Second attempt. This time I tried to compensate for the wind from the beginning, maintaining a constant correction to the left. The approach was better, but the turbulence continued extreme. At 200 feet from the ground, another violent gust made the aircraft rock dangerously. I aborted again. It was on the third attempt that I noticed the engine was sputtering. Small hesitations, momentary power losses. The fuel had run out. I was flying on vapors from the tank. There were no more options. It was now or never. I positioned myself again for the final approach. But this time I knew there wouldn't be a fourth chance. If I missed, it would be fatal. At 1,000 feet height, I gradually cut power and configured for gliding. Flaps fully down, optimal gliding speed at 65 knots. The aircraft descended on a steep trajectory toward the road. The engine sputtered once more, then went silent. Absolute silence except for the sound of wind passing through the aircraft structure. I was making a forced landing. The road seemed to approach very quickly. At 500 feet, I adjusted the trajectory slightly to the left to compensate for lateral drift caused by wind. At 300 feet, I realized I was coming in a bit high. I pushed the nose down to increase the descent rate. At 200 feet, a wind gust pushed the aircraft down. For a second, I thought I was going to hit the trees, but the aircraft recovered altitude right after. Sweat was running into my eyes, making vision difficult. At 100 feet, I finally aligned with the center of the road. Speed was correct. Attitude was good. I could see the texture of the wet asphalt below. 50 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. That's when I saw something that made my blood freeze. A pothole in the asphalt. A huge pothole right in the middle of my landing trajectory, maybe about 1,500 feet ahead. It was big enough to destroy the landing gear if I passed over it at high speed, but there was no time to adjust. I was 10 feet from the ground, perfect touchdown speed, couldn't significantly modify my trajectory anymore. I touched down gently, main wheels first, then the nose wheel. The aircraft rolled over the wet asphalt. I applied brakes gradually, trying to stop before the pothole, but the asphalt was slippery due to rain. The brakes didn't have normal efficiency. The aircraft continued rolling toward the pothole, and I could see I wouldn't be able to stop in time. That's when I made a desperate decision. I turned the rudder sharply to the right, making the aircraft leave the pavement and enter the shoulder covered with grass and mud. Speed decreased drastically due to the soft terrain, but the aircraft began to skid uncontrollably. I felt the landing gear sink into the mud. The propeller was still rotating due to inertia and hit the ground, deforming with a horrible metallic noise. The aircraft slid a few more meters in the mud before finally stopping, tilted to the right due to irregular terrain. For a few seconds, I sat in absolute silence, hands still gripping the yoke, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. I was alive. The aircraft had stopped. There was no fire, no serious injuries. I had successfully made a forced landing. But then I realized I still wasn't completely safe. The storm continued furious outside, with lightning striking nearby and torrential rain. Being inside a metal aircraft during an electrical storm wasn't exactly the safest place. I quickly shut down the electrical systems that still worked, cut the engine mixture to ensure there would be no fire risk, and opened the cabin door. Rain hit me immediately, soaking me in seconds. I jumped from the aircraft and ran to take shelter under a large tree about 150 feet away. There, leaning against the tree trunk, soaked to the bone, shivering from cold and adrenaline, I contemplated aircraft November 748. Charlie Delta stuck in the mud, with the deformed propeller and landing gear sunk in the soft terrain. I had destroyed an aircraft. My first solo flight had ended in an accident. It was likely I could never fly again. Captain Rodriguez would be disappointed. My parents would be furious. The flight school would probably sue me for damages. But I was alive. Against all odds, I had managed to survive a situation that could have been fatal. I stayed there under the tree for about 30 minutes, until the storm began to decrease in intensity. When the rain reduced to a fine drizzle, I left my shelter and walked back to the aircraft for a more detailed inspection. The damage was significant, but not catastrophic. The propeller was bent, the main landing gear had sunk into the mud, and there were some small dents in the fuselage. But the overall structure was intact. With work and money, the aircraft could be repaired. I looked both ways down the road, trying to decide which direction to take to look for help. To the left, the road descended toward a valley. To the right, it climbed toward a ridge. I decided to go right, hoping to find a higher position from where I could get a better view of the region. I walked for about 20 minutes until I reached the top of the ridge, and that's where I had an incredible surprise. On the other side of the ridge, less than 3 miles away, was an airport. It wasn't Cedar Valley Airport where I should have landed, but it was definitely a runway with hangars and other aircraft. I could also see a small town nearby. I had managed to make the forced landing relatively close to civilization. I descended the slope toward the airport. Half an hour later, I was knocking on a hangar door. "Help! I need help! I made a forced landing on the road up there." A middle-aged man, obviously a pilot from the aviation patches on his jacket, opened the door and looked me up and down. "My God, kid, what happened to you?" I quickly explained the situation. He took me inside the hangar, gave me a towel to dry off and a cup of hot coffee. "You were very lucky," he said after hearing my story. "That storm came out of nowhere, caught everyone by surprise. Even we here at the airport had to quickly secure all aircraft." He introduced himself as Tom, owner of a small air taxi company. He explained that the airport where we were was called Mountain View Field and was about 50 miles from Cedar Valley Airport. "You flew 50 miles in the wrong direction, son. The storm must have pushed you here." Tom lent me his phone so I could call Cedar Valley Flight Training. When I managed to speak with Captain Rodriguez, he was beside himself with worry. "Jake, thank God. Where the hell are you? We've been looking for you for 3 hours. We've already contacted the FAA, the fire department, civil defense." I explained where I was and what had happened. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Are you hurt?" was his first question. No, Captain, I'm fine. And the aircraft? Damaged but not destroyed. Bent prop, landing gear stuck, some dents. Another long silence. Jake, you made a forced landing with a dead engine and walked away? Yes, sir. In a storm? Yes, sir. Alone on your first solo flight? Yes, sir. There was an even longer pause. Then I heard something I never expected to hear in Captain Rodriguez's voice. He was laughing. Kid, you may have wrecked an airplane, but you just became a real pilot. The aircraft recovery took 2 days. A specialized company had to use a crane to pull November 748 Charlie Delta out of the mud and transport it back to Cedar Valley Airport. The repairs cost more than $15,000, almost the price of a used aircraft. I expected to be banned forever from the flight school. I expected lawsuits, recriminations, the end of my flying dreams. But what happened was exactly the opposite. The story of the kid who made a forced landing on his first solo flight spread quickly through the regional aviation community. Experienced pilots came to talk to me, wanting to hear every detail of the experience. Some congratulated me for presence of mind in an extreme situation. Others called me lucky. Captain Rodriguez best summarized the situation. Jake, you made some mistakes on that flight. You should have returned immediately when you saw the storm approaching. You should have tried to land at any alternate airport as soon as you realized you were lost. You should have managed fuel better. He paused, looking me directly in the eyes. But when the situation became critical, you kept calm, made the right decisions, and saved your own life. That's not luck. That's competence. You have pilot instinct. 3 weeks later, I was flying again. This time, obviously, with Captain Rodriguez in the right seat. We did several requalification flights, practicing mainly navigation and emergency management. 6 months later, I received my private pilot license. A year later, I started instrument rating training, something that became an absolute priority after my experience with the storm. Today, 25 years later, I'm a commercial pilot with more than 8,000 flight hours. I've flown corporate jets, cargo planes, even some military aircraft during my time in the Air Force Reserve, but I've never forgotten the lessons from that first solo flight. The first lesson is that aviation doesn't forgive complacency. The sky can change in minutes, transforming a routine flight into a fight for survival. Respecting weather conditions isn't cowardice, it's wisdom. The second lesson is that training works. Even being a novice pilot, with less than 50 hours of flight time, the procedures Captain Rodriguez had taught me saved my life. When panic threatened to take over, it was training that allowed me to make the right decisions. The third lesson is that flying isn't about not being afraid. It's about knowing what to do when fear appears. I was terrified during that flight. My hands were shaking, my stomach was churning, my mind was screaming that I was going to die. But I managed to control the fear long enough to do what needed to be done. And the fourth lesson, perhaps the most important, is that sometimes the most difficult situations are the ones that teach us the most. That near-fatal flight taught me more about aviation than any theoretical class could teach. It taught me about my own limits, about the importance of preparation, about the need to always have a plan B. 25 years later, every time I see a young pilot making their first solo flight, I remember that October 15th, 1998. I remember the mixture of terror and determination, desperation and hope, the feeling of being completely alone in the immense blue sky. And I always give the same advice Captain Rodriguez gave me. Focus on what you can control, not what's out of your control. Because in the end, that's what separates a pilot from someone who's simply sitting in an aircraft. A pilot controls what can be controlled, accepts what can't be changed, and has the wisdom to distinguish between the two. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had given up aviation after that accident, if I had let fear win, if I had decided flying was too dangerous, if I had chosen a safer and more predictable path in life. I probably would be a different person today. Maybe more cautious, maybe less prone to taking risks, but certainly not the person who learned that life's greatest challenges often come disguised as the greatest opportunities for growth. Because that near-fatal flight didn't end my dream of flying. It transformed it into something much bigger. It transformed a boy's passion into a life profession. It transformed fear into respect, recklessness into wisdom. inexperience into competence. And it taught me that sometimes, to discover who we really are, we need to get completely lost first. If you made it this far in this story, you probably know the feeling of pursuing a dream that seems impossible, or facing moments when everything seems to go wrong at the same time. Maybe you also have a story of overcoming, of a moment when fear almost won, but you found strength to continue. If this story touched you in some way, if it brought memories of your own challenges or dreams, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment telling about your own experience with decisive moments in life, or simply tell me what you thought of this story. And if you enjoyed hearing this tale from the skies, subscribe to Sky Tales so you don't miss the next episodes. We have many other pilot stories to share, some exciting, others mysterious or real, and told by those who lived these experiences in the heights. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear a story about not giving up on dreams, even when everything seems lost. And if you have your own aviation story to tell, contact us. Who knows, it might become the next Sky Tales episode. Until the next flight, keep your eyes on the sky and your feet on the ground, and remember, sometimes our greatest failures are just our greatest successes in disguise. Thanks for flying with us today.